I'm Pete Hill from Biola University. I'll be chairing this session. Dave Wang from Fuller Seminary will be the presenter, and then Tyler Greenway from Calvin University will provide his comments to Dave's paper. And let me just say very briefly that there could not be two better people to present. Both are theologically informed. They have theological training at the THM or MDiv level, and are outstanding empirical researchers. So we'll get started, and Dave will present first.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Great to be here with you all. I've really enjoyed today. I felt that this morning was very hopeful. Felt like this afternoon started off very thoughtful. And I might land us by depressing everybody. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I tend to have an effect like that with everyone. But when I was reflecting on the topic of today's conference, on the crisis of Christian immaturity, when I first heard about it, it produced this visceral reaction in my heart, because I teach at Fuller, I do research in Fuller, and I'm also a clinical psychologist. I see pastors in my private practice. I'm also a pastor part-time, right? So when I think of spiritual immaturity, Christian immaturity, I feel it in my gut. I see it in my own life. I see it in my clinical work. I see it in my churches. And it is a point of pain. And I think, at least from my standpoint, the language of crisis actually feels quite fitting. And I would like to suggest that even in my research on spiritual formation, the empirical research, Longitudinal, I think it fits quite well with a lot of the research that I'm finding. I don't have time to get into all of it. I'm serious about sticking to 10 minutes. But I do also want to acknowledge the John Templeton Foundation and the Templeton Religion Trust for making this possible. We're actually in year number 7 of what is becoming a 12-year project where for the next 5 years, we are going global and ecumenical to look at embodiments, understandings, and perspectives of Christian formation and Christ-likeness from an ecumenical as well as a global standpoint. But from the perspective of what I'll be sharing today, that's going to come from the first 6 years of our research project, which was largely empirical. And it started with this pie-in-the-sky idea of this question of, can we utilize the social science methodology to, as imperfect as they, and with all the limitations that they might have, can we use that to gain new insight, to shed new insight into the means by which people might become more like Christ? And as many of you know, over the last 20, 30 years, a number of researchers such as Pete Hill have developed these empirically validated measures of spiritual flourishing, virtue, and character dispositions. And what we've done is we created this Frankenstein measure with about 50 or 60 different kinds of constructs, and we unloaded it on 1,500 seminary students from 18 different seminaries, ecumenical seminaries, so Roman Catholic, mainline Protestant, evangelical, historically African-American, Episcopal, so Orthodox, so on and so forth, over a period of 3 years during which COVID-19 happened. So some of our initial publications actually had to do with what are kind of virtues and characters pre-COVID that actually predicted mental health outcomes a year and a half later in the middle of COVID. And virtues like humility actually hold quite a lot of water. Anyway, I'll share a little bit more about that in a little bit. But as you can imagine, this is a very ambitious project, a very ambitious kind of work to try to, and presumptuous kind of work, to try to measure and operationalize something as profound as spiritual maturity, right? So we have there's a lot of caveats, a lot of limitations, so on and so forth. And we acknowledge that we can't directly measure something like that. Instead, we have to rely on indirect measures, indirect indicators that might suggest that formation has occurred, so on and so forth. And over our 7 years of research, alongside some similar research conducted by some friends at Boston University, Stephen Sandage, so combined over 15 years of empirical research into spiritual formation and spiritual maturity, we've identified 3 indirect predictors or correlates of different indicators of spiritual maturity and spiritual flourishing, which I believe also sheds light onto potential considerations into diagnosing where spiritual immaturity might come from, which I know we will step into tomorrow. So what are we talking about? The first empirical longitudinal predictor of spiritual maturity is this construct called differentiation of self. So for those of you who are marriage and family therapists, this actually comes from family systems therapy. And the idea behind differentiation of self is it has to do with one's capacity to navigate this human paradoxical relational need to be both independent and autonomous, as well as belonging to a group that is larger than themselves, connected and intimate with others. So the central question of differentiation is the question of, can I be meaningfully connected to a larger body of people without foreclosing on my own independent thinking? And when we think of differentiation, we oftentimes will start by thinking of failures of differentiation. And I would like to suggest that perhaps one helpful angle towards looking at spiritual immaturity might be through the lens of failures of differentiation. What would be an example of a failure of differentiation? Have you ever met an individual whose for them, their church membership or denominational affiliation is so important to them that they have effectively foreclosed on independent thought? Where perhaps people who belong to their in-group are doing really harmful things that aren't consistent with the Christian faith, and they turn a blind eye because their belongingness to this group is so important to them that they do not possess the capacity to differentiate and call out their own group when perhaps their own group needs to be called out. And I would like to suggest that might be a source of spiritual immaturity. Another form of failure of differentiation has to do on the other polarity of differentiation that has to do with independence and autonomy. And we see a lot of this in COVID-19. I don't know if you've met Christians who have said, well, I've been just watching sermons on YouTube. Why do I need to go back to church? I can just read my Bible and do my own quiet time. I don't need Christian community. I can get everything myself. That's another example of a failure of differentiation. And when I think of differentiation from a theological standpoint, Dietrich Bonhoeffer comes to mind. He wrote a book called Life Together. And although he may not have used the language of differentiation, this is spot on when it comes to differentiation. He says this: let him who cannot be alone beware of community. Let him who is not in community beware of being alone. Each by itself has profound perils and pitfalls. One who wants fellowship without solitude plunges into the void of words and feelings, and the one who seeks solitude without fellowship perishes in the abyss of vanity, self-infatuation, and despair. And what I'd like to suggest is that perhaps there is a dimension of spiritual maturity that is done independently and autonomously, perhaps connected to the spirituality of the desert, but yet they were also in community as well. But there's also a formation that happens in community. And there's something about maturity that embodies a formation in solitude as well as in community. So during the COVID lockdowns, I know many of us were struggling, not being able to physically fellowship with our brothers and sisters. And yet some people took it to a next step, and they would say, this is a fundamental affront to the faith for us to not be able to congregate with other people. And I would suggest that that might be a sign of failure formation, that you do not know how to, you don't know how to follow Jesus in solitude, as opposed to in community. So that's the first empirical predictor of spiritual flourishing. The second one is intercultural competence or intercultural dispositions. And I know that this is a topic that, there's a lot of divergent opinions, especially within American Christianity. But when I think about and explain the relevance, the central relevance of intercultural dynamics in our spiritual life, I start with the fact or the suggestion that our relationship with God is fundamentally an intercultural relationship, right? For those of us who teach or have taken hermeneutics classes, that is ultimately a class on intercultural dynamics, where we navigate the social, cultural, political context at the time Scripture was written, and we apply that to the current cultural context that we are in today. And I would also like to suggest that if this idea that if you don't possess the capacity to build a close friendship or a relationship with another human being who you can see, that happens to look different from you, think different from you, vote different from you, what likelihood do you have to say that you are building an intimate relationship with a God who's transcendent, right? So depending on where in the world I give this presentation, when I'm in America, I will remind people that, God's not American. And I would like to suggest that the more we think that God votes like us, thinks like us, has our American values, the less we probably know who God actually is. The less we actually have space in our hearts to relate to God as he is on his own. When I think of Old Testament warnings about idolatry, it's about how even though humans are created in the image of God, that humans have this disposition to want to create God out of their image, that also includes creating God out of our cultural image as well. The third and last empirical predictor that I like to share is the construct of religious quest. And religious quest is speaking about one's capacity or ability to engage in existential questions without simplifying in complexity, perceiving religious questioning and doubt as positive, maintaining this openness, an open disposition to change religious ideals and beliefs, or perhaps evolve and grow our religious ideals and beliefs. And when I think of religious quest, I think of growing up in church, attending Sunday school, and I don't know if you can relate to this, but in a lot of the Sunday school classes I grew up with, there was always that one kid that would tick off the Sunday school teacher, because they would be the one asking those existential philosophical questions that there's no answer to, And all the while, the rest of us were just being good boys and good girls, and just going with the flow, and just taking in whatever they were teaching, and just not really doing much with it other than accepting it, as is. And this notion of religious quest suggests the possibility that perhaps that one person who kept asking those difficult questions, that might have been the only kid in the whole room that was taking the Sunday school seriously, because that person was actually struggling internally with, well, can I own this? And before I can own this, I have to make sure that this is what I believe as well, right? And when I think of the labels that were placed on children like that, who asked those hard questions, I reflect on the question of, well, to what extent do our churches and seminaries not only explicitly, but actually implicitly support the ingredients that actually cultivate and support spiritual maturity? Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your paper and presentation. I appreciate the opportunity to learn more from your work. It was a good opportunity to read more of David's work. I was actually starting to get a little down on myself as I was reading this work. I was very excited to read it, but then I was also like kind of getting down. I was like, why have I not read more of this? Have I just been wasting time all along? It was like this emotional roller coaster while I was reading things. So thank you. Before I jump into my response, I'll introduce, nope, you good? Okay. I'll introduce myself very briefly, a little bit more introduction. Like David, my path to psychology is connected to my, there we are. Like David, my path to psychology is connected to my experience in ministry. I attended seminary with the intentions of pursuing full-time pastoral ministry, but had questions about Christian formation that led me to pursue psychological studies. And now much of my research focuses on the psychology of religion, character and virtue development, and the application of psychology in ministry contexts, much of which relates really well to this idea of Christian maturity. David's presentation and my comments today focus on the empirical evidence for Christian maturity and immaturity. David's paper helps us focus on the problem we face. Common approaches to discipleship and theological education don't seem to be working. This is a focus of much of the paper. And then in his presentation here, he's highlighted potential solutions to this problem, particularly these 3 evidence-based predictors of spiritual maturity. And my comments today will follow those 2 broad focuses, the problem we face and also potential solutions to this problem. More specifically, I'd like to highlight and build on David's work by noting that as we investigate this problem that we're facing, we need to do a few things. We need to reconcile various bodies of research. We need to consider confounds. We need to be mindful of moderators. And we need to diagnose design problems. I kind of stumbled into some alliteration there, so kind of ran with it. I'd also like us to consider how we might develop an evidence-based solution by clearly identifying our intentions, quelling our quibbling, that was the hardest alliteration, and prioritizing practical assessment. So if you're the note-taking type, I'll highlight those things again. I want to highlight and build on David's work by noting that as we investigate this problem empirically, we must reconcile various bodies of research, consider confounds, be mindful of moderators, and diagnose design problems. And as we think about a potential solution, we need to clearly identify our intentions, quell our quibbling, and prioritize practical assessments. I'll begin with the problem, follow with a few notes regarding the development of a solution. So first, in his paper, David helps us better understand the problem of Christian immaturity using empirical evidence. He notes new lows in public esteem related to honesty and ethics among clergy, frequent cases of misconduct among leaders, and longitudinal studies that suggest discipleship practices and theological education seem to fail in their attempts to increase spiritual maturity. More specifically, David outlines several elements of this problem. Common approaches to discipleship and education do not seem to be effective. They may reinforce hiding, pretense, and people-pleasing, and they fail to recognize that spiritual formation is not a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. As we continue to delve into this problem, I'd like us to keep those 4 things related to it in mind. So first, we need to reconcile various bodies of research, particularly seemingly contradictory findings. So we're very interdisciplinary here, so there's reconciliation that needs to happen. But even within the empirical body of research, we need to reconcile all of these findings, particularly when they seem contradictory. Not to skip ahead to later in the day, not to steal anyone's thunder, but in Christian Miller's examination of group comparisons, he points to many studies identifying behavioral differences between Christians and non-Christians. And he finds that often Christians are more compassionate, less malevolent, more honest, and more self-controlled. And this raises a question. If discipleship and theological education don't seem to be effective, why do we still observe these differences? Now, we can point to a few things. Many of the studies named in David's presentation are longitudinal. They focus on change over time, whereas Christian examines larger group differences. If you're like me, you probably have too much respect for both scholars to just discount their work entirely here. We want to continue to consider these things seriously. So what do? Well, one first step will be continuing to reconcile these bodies of research. One option for this reconciliation brings me to my second point. We must consider confounds. Now, this is kind of a technical research term, but confounds are alternative explanations for research findings. And we need to consider other variables that could explain or contribute to the immaturity we observe within these longitudinal studies. So for instance, David notes that honesty and ethics ratings for clergy have reached all-time lows. Now, given the number of other professions that also received low ratings, Gallup notes that nearly all professions show some decline in honesty ethics ratings, we may need to ask whether we are experiencing both a specific mistrust of clergy and a broader, more general culture of declining trust. In addition to decreased trust in clergy and other professions, we might consider other trends as well. We continue to hear reports about the general decline in religious affiliation within the U.S., and in their papers, other presenters have also highlighted the influence of moralistic therapeutic deism and the influence of an Americanized Christianity focused on control, security, and comfort. So we can ask, could these cultural trends also contribute to some of the declines we observe within longitudinal studies? And might we still observe the overall group differences noted by Miller amidst these declines? So in other words, might some of these cultural trends affect both the religious and non-religious? One of my former supervisors often quoted the author Peter Drucker saying, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." So in other words, our strategy and tactics must be supported by people who buy into that strategy. So if we're experiencing a culture of declining trust, declining religious affiliation, and improper vision, might that culture be eating our strategy, specifically our discipleship and education strategy, for breakfast? In other words, might part of this problem we observe within longitudinal studies be attributed to these broader cultural trends? Maybe not all, but might part of it be, such that our strategy is no longer supported by people who buy into that strategy. Third, if considering confounds can help reconcile various bodies of research, what else should we pay attention to as we investigate this problem empirically? Well, we must also be mindful of moderators. Now, if I can take a brief step into social scientific research design, everyone stay awake for a second. Moderators are variables that answer the question, for whom is a practice or program effective? So when the effectiveness of one variable in terms of how it influences a second variable depends on a third variable. So one variable, its influence on the second variable, depends on a third variable. We call that third variable a moderator. So if education only leads to maturity for particular types or groups of people, those types or groups of people are what we call a moderator. And moderators help us understand for whom a practice or program is effective. And David helpfully identifies different profiles of spirituality among first-year seminary students. He finds one group with high impression management scores and a second with highly anxious attachments to God. As David puts it in his paper, these findings suggest that almost half of our sample of seminary students may seem, at least at first glance, to be thriving and flourishing, but upon further investigation may not in fact be completely honest with themselves and others about the reality of how they're actually doing, and the other half may be masking a pronounced implicit fear that God may not love them and may abandon them at a moment's notice. So in considering these different groups of people, David raises questions about the degree to which one-size-fits-all discipleship and education programs are accounting for such differences. These questions are really important. For whom is our discipleship or education effective? Have we tailored these programs to those who are inclined toward impression management or anxious attachment? Might we observe that the relation between education and maturity works for one group, but not both? Or is our discipleship and theological education tailored to another group that no longer exists? We might continue to find that discipleship and theological education are ineffective for both groups because, as Scott Cormode from Fuller Seminary writes, the church as we know it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists, thinking specifically about our programs and education here. Fourth, and related to the previous point, as we continue to clarify the problem before us, we must diagnose design problems. In other words, might the design, the arrangement, order, outcomes, the design of our discipleship and education require adjustments? David describes these three characteristics that predict spiritual growth: differentiation of self, intercultural competence, and religious quest. And each of these predictors, he notes, are often most clearly seen in our relational life and our approach to relating to ourselves, others, and the world. David's observation help us consider whether we're aiming for the wrong target within our discipleship and theological education programs. These findings remind me of a quote from Ann Snyder's book, The Fabric of Character. In her book, Snyder writes about how organizations form character, and she argues that those organizations that successfully develop character and virtue, quote, may have other ends in view: health, economic empowerment, rehabilitation, but in so doing, transform people's behavior and moral sense. Snyder's arguing here that those organizations that are successfully developing character and virtue are not directly aiming for character and virtue development. Their explicit goal is not character and virtue development. Instead, character and virtue are produced within a community that has other goals in mind, other goals they're pursuing. Perhaps we have a similar problem. In other words, are we trying to use discipleship and theological education to develop spiritual maturity directly, when we should be using discipleship and theological education to form other things, perhaps these relationally focused qualities that in turn produce spiritual maturity? So rather than first encouraging people to grow closer to God, perhaps we must first prepare people for this relationship with God by helping them experience and understand who they are in relationship to God and others, self-differentiation, who they are in relation to other cultures and the world, intercultural competence, and who they are in relationship to their beliefs, religious quest. Those qualities may in turn provide fertile ground from which spiritual maturity may grow. Now, all of what I've noted so far focuses on how David's work helps us understand the problem of Christian immaturity. And thankfully, David's highlighting of these three characteristics that predict spiritual growth: differentiation of self, intercultural competence, and religious quest. These three characteristics also help us take steps to developing an evidence-based solution. So as we continue discussions about solutions to this problem, I'd like to highlight three things related to David's research. First, the importance of clearly identifying our intentions, our goals, targets, and objectives. David helpfully notes that many seminaries do not have a formal or working institutional definition of personal and spiritual formation, and that this lack of definition is understandable given the difficulties of defining such terms. And in their papers, other presenters have noted similar challenges related to identifying or defining outcomes. And related research from Fuller Seminary has also found that some of the goals noted most often by ministry leaders, goals like discipleship, developing a relationship with God, faith formation, those common goals were also rated as some of the most difficult, least clear, and least satisfactory in their progress. These themes and findings emphasize the importance of clarity in both goals and our path toward those goals. Other presenters have also noted problems related to bad outcomes, so not just unclear outcomes, but bad outcomes, such as an absence of any goals after conversion, focusing on growth in numbers and giving and ministries offered, so this is otherwise known as the problem of focusing on nickels and noses, butts and bucks, attendance and giving. Others have noted an overemphasis on head knowledge or a focus on control, security, and comfort or enjoyment. In contrast to these problematic outcomes, David points us to clear, evidence-based predictors of spiritual maturity. So as we continue to discuss solutions to the problem of spiritual maturity, I hope we continue to elevate these outcomes that are both clear and good. These things help empirical investigations. Second, as we more clearly identify our intentions, I'd like to encourage us to quell our quibbling. Now, I know we will disagree about what it means to be spiritually mature, and I hope we disagree because those disagreements sharpen our understanding of what maturity is. But I do hope we can avoid quibbling if it leads us to apathy or inaction. So please don't hear me saying we shouldn't disagree. I know we will, I hope we do, but I hope we don't quibble fruitlessly. I say this because assessing something like spiritual maturity can be overwhelming from an empirical standpoint. How do we gather data on everything related to spiritual maturity? I don't think I can create an assessment that long. Instead, in an effort to help us understand at least some aspects of maturity, I wonder about a piecemeal, iterative approach to assessing spiritual maturity. Might we identify some qualities that predict or mark spiritual maturity, even if we don't identify them all, and move forward with those outcomes? This kind of approach can help us continue to understand what works and doesn't work, and enables us to iterate and improve. So as we review David's 3 characteristics, we may be quick to point to things that are not included. That's fine, but might we quell our quibbling and at least start here with some evidence-based predictors, expanding and iterating as we move forward? And third, as we think about these outcomes and the assessments attached to them, I'd like to encourage us to prioritize practical assessment. Perhaps one reason attendance and giving, nickels and noses, butts and bucks, are often default outcomes in our ministries or denominations is that they're easy to assess. Whatever outcomes we pursue, we need to consider not only what assessment tools scholars might use, but also how ministry leaders can identify and measure these outcomes. How might religious leaders assess differentiation of self, intercultural competence, religious quest? What does growth in these qualities look like amongst leaders and amongst congregations? If we prioritize practical assessment, we can help shift the metrics on which our ministries focus. So in conclusion, as we continue to understand the problem, I hope we reconcile various bodies of research, consider confounds, be mindful of moderators, and diagnose these design problems. And as we develop an evidence-based solutions, I hope we clearly identify our intentions while quelling our quibbling and prioritizing practical assessment. Thank you.